Today we have the honor and privilege of having with us Nominchimeg. She is the advisor to the Speaker of the Mongolian Parliament. She is by training a lawyer who has been now in the legislative section of the Mongolian state. Welcome to Reason, the New Indians platform, where we get to the reason behind the issues that concern you. Welcome, Ms. Nominchimeg.
Hello, very nice to meet you.
Thank you. I have been in Mongolia for the last 10 days and it's been a fantastic journey. And I want to understand, how has Mongolia grown legislatively? How has Mongolia changed in the last few years through legislation? You are an expert in law. By training, you have been a lawyer. And you can probably tell us, how has law helped Mongolia become a more efficient and a stronger democracy?
As you might be aware, Mongolia transitioned to a market economy and democratic regime in early 1990s. So it's been the last 30 years has been a very transitional period of time for Mongolia. Especially in terms of private property, market economy, how it works in Mongolia, because we've been in the socialist regime for the last 70 years. So speaking of the last few years, I guess I should start from the constitutional amendments that took place in 2019, actually, under the leadership of the current Speaker of the Parliament, Mr. Zandan. Mongolia made major amendments to its constitution. So the constitutional amendments basically aimed to have better governance, more check and balance that is workable in the current situation, and many more that actually became the basis of founding democratic institutions in Mongolia, such as the political parties. We've included the main principles that we will adhere to in founding political parties and for activities of political parties. So with the constitutional amendments, we have now constitutional framework for the cabinet to work in a more stably, because in the last 30 years, I think the average period of one government, one cabinet was 1.6 years. So that's quite short, considering that the parliament election period is 4 years. Mm-hmm. So we've now have the mechanisms where the government and the parliament can effectively basically check and balance the government powers.
So you have changed the duration of the elected government's time period. Can you explain the time period for the president, for the prime minister, for the parliament? Can you give our audience a brief, perhaps an overview of how Mongolian parliament functions?
Okay, great. So Mongolia is a parliamentary democracy, but it has its own characteristics.
Yeah.
So the parliament is the supreme body of governing the country. The general election takes place once in every 4 years. And Mongolia is a unitary system where the central government has the more power. And then the parliament, of course, elects its cabinet from itself. We do have the cabinet, the prime minister, responsible for answering to the parliament. But at the same time, we have a president who is elected actually from the people. It's not elected from the parliament, but from the people. Directly from the people.
So the duration for the president's time and prime minister's period they're different?
It was same before 2019, but it was changed with the constitutional amendments. With the constitutional amendments, now the the term of the presidency is extended to 6 years, and the president can be only elected once. So there's no second term or third term, so that president can represent really the people of Mongolia and the country without further, concerns over getting elected.
So during those 6 years of president's term, basically there is only one parliamentary general election?
Well, it can be one or two, because the parliament general election is once in 4 years. So the latest last general election took place in 2020, and the next will be next year, 2024. But the presidential election took place in 2021, and the next will be 2027.
Yeah. So there's a difference. Why is there this difference? Does it have a logic behind it?
Well, the philosophy behind is that the president is the symbol of unity of Mongolia, and it should function as basically a balancing mechanism between the government institution. And if the term of the parliament and the term of the presidency would be the same, the check and balance might not work well. So there's a gap between the term.
And in parliament, do you have a lower house, upper house? Do you have that kind of a system?
The Mongolian parliament is just one chamber parliament. So we have 76 parliament members at the moment, just one chamber. And then actually the president, although it's the institution of president elected from the people, can partially also function as the similar to the second upper house
yes, yeah.
of other.
Yeah, so in a way you do have two chambers, but it's like president's chamber and then the prime minister's or the cabinet.
Cabinet, yes. Exactly.
So in the last few years, what are the major legislations which you have made for, let's say, social welfare of the country?
So the Speaker of the Parliament now promulgated basically the legislative initiatives. We call it the New Recovery Legislative Initiative. And it basically comprised 3 sectors. One is, as you say, is a social welfare. So on social policy and social welfare, we are currently working on the package of social security laws to basically increase the social security for the people of Mongolia. It comprises of course, the pension system. It comprises social welfare for the people, and the draft package law is still being discussed at the parliament. In social policy, we also are just now currently discussing the education law. So education is basically the basic of the foundation of every country, how it would see themselves in 10 years, and etc. So the parliament is now currently reading the package of educational law that aims to bring reform in the Mongolian educational system. The third is health sector. The government is working on several actually legislative initiatives on healthcare sector, including social health law, because I think the government so far focused on providing medical services, treatments to the people. Now the government is shifting its focus on actually preventing diseases and providing inclusive healthcare services to its people. So that's basically on the legislative agenda of the current parliament. The second line of reform we are trying to do is on the business sector, improving the business environment and foreign direct investment, and decreasing the government's participation in market economy, providing, making more space to the business sector, the private sector, to have a healthier competition among the businesses, and etc. And several important legislations are actually being prepared and submitted to the parliament.
So India also used to have quite a challenging system of doing business. In fact, We were very low on the ease of doing business list. What about Mongolia? Is it easier to do business in Mongolia? Have you made legislations which bring some kind of a reform which makes it easier for foreign direct investment?
Yes, indeed. Mongolia ranks, well, I guess, in the middle range of doing business in terms of the index. It scores quite high in terms of the legal framework. It has world standard legislative frameworks, but I think the weaknesses for the government or for Mongolia in doing businesses on the enforcement of contracts. So the efficiency of court system and efficiency of enforcement mechanism is still needs to be worked. But in the past, government and the parliament has worked on several key legislation on making the business environment better. One of the key legislative reform we did is on permitting law. So for businesses to get permits and licenses from the government, there has been a criticism that it's very bureaucratic, it takes long time, and maybe there are too many requirements for getting permits. So with the legislative reform on law and permitting, we decreased the number of permits actually required for the whole country. In every business sector was decreased to 400 or 500 from 2,600. So the number of required permits and filings were decreased and the procedures were simplified. And it became easy for the businesses to apply for and get government license and permits.
How easy is the immigration policy of Mongolia? Do you have any legislation which invites more immigration into Mongolia?
So immigration, I would say it's relatively liberal and well-built system. So the immigration office has different, of course, visa types depending on the purpose of the visit. So for investors and for business purposes, there are certain types, and it's with required documents, it can be easily applied and received. This year, the government is trying to make Mongolia as a tourist destination. So it announced basically 2013 will be Visit Mongolia year. And with that, we are also currently doing legislative reform in the area of tourism. With the tourism law, we are trying to actually ease the requirements for getting visas to travel to Mongolia. So we are digitalizing, so online application of visa is being introduced in the draft law, and I think actually the draft law will be passed in the next couple of days.
How has this particular government focused on development? What all has been happening on the development front in Mongolia?
Okay, so I think the government and the parliament is currently focusing on a number of issues, and I think the most priority issue is corruption and fighting corruption and eliminating the risk of corruption has been a big task for the government and also to the parliament. So on that front, the parliament is initiating and passing different legislative documents and setting a long-term policy on anti-corruption. It's basically a hindrance to development.
Yes.
It's identified as one of the biggest challenges and hindrance to development in Mongolia.
So the government is focusing on that. In India, in the West, there's so much going on LGBTQ. What are the laws related to LGBTQ communities, other minorities, and human rights in Mongolia?
So Mongolia, as you know, is dubbed as kind of oasis of democracy in Central Asia. So citizens of Mongolia enjoy the freedom of speech, the right to assembly and right to expression. And that also applies to LGBTQ community. The society is becoming more receptive and inclusive of minority groups. In terms of legislative matters, at the moment, Mongolia does require that the marriage should be between two opposite sexes. This is, I guess, the law legislation evolves really based on the society, how the tradition and how the society is, whether the society is actually ready for that. So I think the Mongolian society is very open to the debate.
Mongolia has also several tribes, different regions also, but majority of the population lives in Ulaanbaatar city. I want to understand what kind of laws are there for rural sections of Mongolia. Even though I think 40% people still live in rural areas, but larger communities are coming to Ulaanbaatar city. How are you coping with this rapid urbanization around one big city, around the capital city? This is probably one of the unique cases in the world where the largest amount of population is in the capital city.
Yes, indeed. I think statistically almost 50% of the population lives in the city. And then Mongolia's, vast. The territory of Mongolia is quite big, and it is one of the most sparsely populated country in Mongolia. So the concentration of population in one capital city has been a big issue for Mongolia, and is one of the big topic for the constitutional amendment that took place in 2019. So with the constitutional amendments, we have revised the local government, local administration law, providing more, power and self-governance to those local governments. But at the same time, Mongolia, with the constitution, assures right to actually travel and live wherever they want. So in recent years, the government has initiated a program to have urban and rural balance. And in order to implement that, the government has initiated several, incentive programs for people to migrate back into the countryside and work there, providing more incentives to work in the countryside.
What kind of incentives?
So the incentives include mostly financial incentives. You get also subsidy in doing business and doing business in rural areas. The investment law also provides more tax incentives in the form of tax stabilization if you do more business and investment in rural areas.
Are you able to cater to the basics in Ulaanbaatar city for everyone? Is there enough infrastructure, or are you building more? And do you have a plan for the capital city for perhaps, let's say, next 5 years?
Because this issue is very central to the government's policy, they have a new minister in charge of decentralization and decongestion in the cabinet now. As you said, I think the population of the Ulaanbaatar city is increasing rapidly, and the infrastructure and the development of basic infrastructure is not catching up. But with urbanization, building more buildings instead of having Gary districts, having more planned city has been the agenda of the government. Also, the government has announced that it will build several satellite cities.
So you were talking about these satellite cities that are going to come up in Mongolia in the next few years.
Yes, we have a new airport called Chinggis Khan, recently opened to cater for international travels to Mongolia. And government is building and planning and building a satellite city near the airport so that the congestion and centralization of Ulaanbaatar city can be dispersed. At the same time, the parliament last year adopted a resolution to establish a new city in Orkhon Valley, Karakorum, which is historically was Mongolia's capital city since the 14th century. So I think a big plan to build a new city.
You are one of the few women who are working in the power circles of Ulaanbaatar and Mongolia. I want to know, what has the government done legislatively for the empowerment of women? Where do Mongolian women stand today in the Mongolian power structures?
It's a very topical question, because at the moment the parliament is reading an amendment to the election law and a political party law. So in 2011, the parliament enacted a law on gender equality. And this law basically aimed to ensure gender equality in all sectors of spheres of social life, including family, in education and healthcare, and also in decision-making and power circles. Unfortunately, the implementation of the law has been not sufficient. So now the government is initiating and taking leadership in including and providing more gender equal mechanism for women to climb up to the power circle and be more representative and participative in decision making. In the amendment to the election law, the government is increasing the gender quota from 20% to 30%. So one gender, it can be, of course, male, and at some point maybe male. One gender would be represented at least 30%. And then we are also introducing a proportional system to our election system, where in the party list, the gender representation will be 1 versus 1.
Okay.
So it's not like in the top 10 or top 15 men and then women in the bottom, but it will be like woman, men,
so
woman.
Candidates who can contest elections.
Yes.
So it will be almost like 50%?
Yes, in the proportional list, in the proportional part of the election, it will be 50%.
So this is perhaps happening for the first time in Mongolia's history?
Yes.
And apart from being in the ministry, in the parliament, what is the status of women in other spheres? Let's say civil services, let's say engineering, let's say medicine, let's say law. What is are Mongolian women in all the spheres competing, or are there reservations, affirmative action for women in other spheres?
Mongolia ranks relatively high in gender equality gap index. I think it ranks very high in education and healthcare. So that means women can get health services, similar, more maybe better than men, and education. More women are educated. If you look at the higher education institution, I think more than half of the class will be women. And then if you look at also sectors like general business sector, I think the executive, 1/3 of the executive director of Mongolian top businesses is women. In sectors like education and health, actually there's reverse. I mean, I guess gender equality. Perhaps 80–90% of the labor is women.
Okay, education and health.
Education and health. What Mongolia lacks in gender equality gap is in decision making and political participation. So this is where we are working on.
That is why there is this legislation happening. But at the school level, at the college level, university level, you have free education for everyone or for girl child? Are there any such laws?
So for education, we have free education for all primary education that is promulgated in the Constitution, and girls and boys can have equal education. We have co-education, and I think the higher you go up in terms of levels and education, you will see more women in the classroom.
Okay, and this is without any affirmative action?
This is without any affirmative action, and I think that's basically culturally in the blood of Mongolians.
Yeah, so talk about that.
You will see that scholars and famous historians wrote that actually Mongolian queens in the Middle Ages, during Genghis Khan and 13th and 14th century, had more power actually than men, because they were the ones who would actually be at the home where men are in war. So wars. They would know, they would be in power of all
healthcare, education, social welfare.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then during the socialist regime, I think one of the key philosophy of that period is gender equality, and woman is
had equal rights.
Equal rights, and the workforce participation and economic participation was very high. And that actually...
That has carried on.
Carried on.
Even during the parliamentary democracy.
Even during the parliamentary democracy, I think.
And tell me, what about the crime against women in Mongolia? Is it something which is of concern, or Mongolia has been generally a peaceful nation where crime rate is low?
I think I would say it's not unique. Okay. Of course, in some crime like domestic violence, most of the victims are women. But at the same time, the studies show that boys are more prone and vulnerable to domestic violence if you look at the child statistics.
Yeah, so you're saying both culturally as well as legislatively, women have freedom. Women can take up any jobs in Mongolia. There is no restriction, no prohibition at a cultural level, social level, and no prohibition at the legislative level.
Definitely no prohibition or no cultural restriction for a woman to take up any job. There are women in mining sector. We have generals, like in the army, women generals, and that's quite normal.
So women are like actively in military as well?
Yes, if you want, you can join the military, and then we have our women generals. In peacekeeping operations, we do have Mongolian women participate.
But are they trained for combat services?
There's no compulsive military service for women.
Okay, no, not compulsory.
Not compulsory.
But then, why have women in Mongolia not entered politics so much? We don't hear about too many Mongolian politicians who are women.
I think the factors and reasons would be very universal. You know, going up to, I think for mid-level career, women are very successful, but because of family and children, their opportunities to go up to the hierarchy and be in the decision-making sphere is low. At the same time, specifically in politics, I think the current system for election and political activities is kind of restrictive to women, because the Mongolian election politics requires a lot of financing. Women might not have as many avenues as men would have.
Now, you as a woman who has been in private sector and then switched to public sector, tell us, like, how has this transition been, and do you encourage more women to join the government, to join politics, and to be in the power structures?
Well, definitely. I mean, I joined the public service 2 years ago. And it's been quite a transformative experience for me. But the joy of public service, I mean, doing public service, is that that we still do have a lot of hope that we can make positive changes, and we see the results. So it motivates people for those who want to do better the society and make positive changes to the society.
Well, on that note, thank you very much for this opportunity to talk to you about Mongolia and Mongolia's lawmakers. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.